Before marble and myth hardened into legend, a sprint beside an ash altar changed how a civilization kept time. We're traveling to Olympia, 776 BCE, the grove of Zeus, the sacred truce, and a measured strip of earth called the Stadion, where a crown of wild olive outweighed gold and a single victory became year one in Greek memory. Across 5 chapters, we'll uncover the origins, the people, the preparation, the first race itself, and the 1,000-year legacy it sparked, grounded in archaeology, ancient victor lists, and eyewitness descriptions. Settle in, steady your breath, and step to the line. The first Olympics are about to begin. Chapter 1. The Dawn of the Olympiads. Between 2 rivers in the western Peloponnese, where the Alpheos flows broad and brown, and the Cladios comes down in a smaller stony course from the north, there lay a grove the Greeks called the Altis. It was, long before marble rose elsewhere, a sacred place of trees and earth, a precinct set apart for the king of the gods. Here, at Olympia in the land of Elis, Greeks would gather from distant polis and rugged islands to honor Zeus with sacrifice and contest. In that grove, the habit of measuring time by years gave way to measuring time by a shared memory of victory, and a man's name, Koroibos of Elis, became the first recorded point on a Panhellenic calendar. The festival that would come to define Greek unity began not with marble colonnades or sculptors' wonders, but with the older permanence of a circular altar of ash and the dusty straight of a racecourse measured in the steps of heroes. To understand why the first Olympic festival mattered, one has to see the world that produced it. In the 8th century BCE, the Greek world was a patchwork of communities experimenting with forms of rule, from noble councils to emergent kingship to the seeds of the citizen-run polis. The age is remembered for the geometric style painted on pottery, for the earliest inscriptions scratched in an alphabet adapted from Phoenicia, and for oral poems, soon to be fixed in writing, that sang of heroes and gods. Communities were still defining themselves, but they shared language, customs, and myth. Sanctuaries like Olympia, Delphi, and Isthmia became neutral ground where rival cities could meet under a shared religious purpose. Olympia's appeal lay in its antiquity and its location. A fertile plain near the sea, reachable by roads from Arcadia and Messenia, from Achaia and beyond. Olympia's traditions reached back into the mythic time. Greeks told of Pelops, the Lydian youth who won his bride Hippodamia by outwitting and outracing her father, the fearsome king Unamas, whose mares were sired by the winds. Pelops, aided by Poseidon or by the treacherous charioteer Myrtilus, accounts differ, overcame Unamas in a deadly chariot contest, and on that victory, the Pelopid line took root. A mound at Olympia, the Pelopian, was regarded as his hero's tomb and received sacrifices. Later visitors in the Roman era saw it still, earthen and fenced, anchored in the sanctuary's memory. The myth took the shape of a founding charter, placing contest at the heart of Olympia's identity and linking it to a legendary event of racing and cunning near the banks of the Alpheos. Another tradition named Heracles as the founder, not the club-bearing hero of labors only, but an organizer who measured the stadium with his own feet, planted a wild olive, and instituted prizes cut from its branches. Greeks did not confuse etiological myth with recent history. Instead, they wove myth with cult and cult with practice. The wild olive was real. The crown mattered. The foot race existed. The story gave them a divine frame that made sense of the human actions they took every 4 years. Such tales did not invent the festival so much as anchor it in a world where gods and heroes had once walked. And in that act of anchoring, they gave the rites depth and age. The sanctuary's religious life preceded stone architecture. Before the great temple of Zeus and before the colossal chryselephantine statue by Pheidias, both absent in the first centuries, there was the altar. The main altar of Zeus was a mound of compacted ash, shaped over time by the sacrificial thighs of cattle burned and mixed with water from the Alpheos. Priests tended it, adding layers as years passed, reinforcing the holy with the residue of piety. At festival time, smoke and the scent of burnt thigh bones would have drifted across the grove, mingling with dust from the runner's path. The cult of Hera also took root at Olympia, and a temple to Hera, the Heraion, eventually rose in the 7th century BCE, one of the earliest Doric temples in Greece. At the first recorded celebration, in 776 BCE, there were no stone colonnades as later visitors would know them, but the gods were already present in altar, offering, and oath. Between myth and ash stood the institutions that gave the festival its distinctive shape. One of the most durable was the Ekateria, the sacred truce. Tradition credits Iphitos, a king of Elis, with reinstituting the festival after consulting the oracle at Delphi during a time of plague and civil strife. In some retellings, he stood alongside Lycurgus of Sparta, that archetypal lawgiver. In others, Argos too had a hand. These stories are layered with the politics of later interpretation, yet they point to an early, persistent truth. Elis claimed custodianship, and the truce was real. Heralds, the Spondophoroi, set out before each festival to announce the truce across the Greek world. For the duration, athletes, officials, and spectators traveling to and from Olympia were to be left unmolested. The truce did not end wars, but it carved a corridor of safety through them. And in that corridor, Greeks could enact a different order where the measure of a man was a time, a throw, a grapple, or a crown. Athletics in Greece did not emerge at Olympia. There is a strong tradition of athletic display embedded in epic song. The funeral games of Patroclus in the Iliad present a catalogue of contests: chariot race, boxing, wrestling, running, spear throwing, that reflect values of heroism and competitive excellence arrayed. Such contests, whether poetic elaborations or reflections of real-life practices, show how Greeks framed competition as a way of honoring the dead and the gods. Gymnic exercise, running, wrestling, and the like became part of education for free males. The word agon designated struggle and contest, and Greek life was thick with it. In law courts, in poetry competitions, in marketplaces of ideas, and on dusted ground. What made Olympia distinctive was not the invention of sport, but the elevation of athletic victory to a pan-Hellenic honor, and the insistence that the prize have no material value. Victors won a crown of wild olive, the kotinos, cut with a sacred knife. They received, in their home cities, free meals at state expense, or special privileges, but at Olympia itself, the prize was symbolic and potent. The crown conferred kleos, fame, the echo of one's name in the mouths of others, and it bound the victor's achievement to Zeus's sacred place. Later poets like Pindar would make a vocation of singing that fame into immortality, but already the logic was in place in the 8th century. Compete before all Greeks, accept a humble crown from a sacred tree, and be memorialized in records kept by the sanctuary's stewards. Those records matter for understanding the first Olympics in the historical sense. Greeks developed a habit of enumerating the festivals, counting the 4-year periods as Olympiads. One could date events by the year of an Olympiad and the name of the stadion victor that year. The earliest victor lists, compiled by an Elean Hippias in the 5th century BCE, relied on sanctuary memory and inscription. Later chronographers such as Timaeus refined the system, and still later Eusebius preserved versions of it. In that sequence, the year we call 776 BCE corresponds to the first Olympiad, whose victor's name was remembered. Coroibos of Elis, winner of the stadion race, a sprint over one length of the track. He is sometimes described as a cook or baker, an artisan of the ordinary who in that sprint crossed into a different register of fame. The stadion itself gives a measure not only of distance, but of thinking. At Olympia, the stadion length was approximately 600 feet, and tradition gave those feet to Heracles, though archaeological measurement offers precision, roughly 192 meters. The track lay east of the Altis, aligned so that runners sprinted with Mount Kronion to the north and the sanctuary to their back left. In the earliest period, the starting and finishing marks were simple. Only in later centuries would the starting mechanism, the hysplex, with its falling chords designed to prevent false starts, become a feature of Greek tracks. For the first recorded games, the contest was elemental: bare feet or sandals on baked earth, a straight run, a judge's eye to determine who crossed first. The earliest program was spare. The 776 festival appears to have had a single event, the stadion race. Additional events were added over subsequent Olympiads: the double stadion diaulos, the long-distance dolichos, the wrestling and the pentathlon, boxing, chariot racing, and later the pankration and the armed race, the hoplitodromos. Tradition fixes these additions to specific Olympiads: the diaulos in 724 BCE, the dolichos in 720 BCE, wrestling and pentathlon in 708, boxing in 688, the four-horse chariot in 680, the pankration in 648, and the hoplitodromos in 520. By then, the program consumed several days. In 776, it likely lasted one day. Olympia's grandeur grew by accretion, not by sudden decree. One must imagine the place before its later magnificence. The grove had sacred boundaries, marked by simple walls and markers. The Altis was a cluster of trees near the foot of the Kronion, with altars and offering stands. Dedications, bronze tripods, figurines of men, women, and animals accumulated as gifts from cities and individuals seeking favor or marking gratitude. Processions came with wreaths and garlands, oxen led for sacrifice, and the smell of barley meal and wine on the altar before the knife did its work. Music and the hum of many dialects filled the air. Greekness expressed itself in differences made compatible by shared rites. The Eleans governed the sanctuary and provided its judges, the Hellenodikai. Their role would formalize in later periods, with training and rules codification. In the earliest games, they still presided, choosing who could compete and awarding the crown. The selection of athletes was open to Greeks, by language and ancestry rather than by political alliance. It is important to underline that Greek here was not an empire or a nation-state, but a culture of many communities spread around the Aegean and beyond. The festival functioned as a stage where that culture recognized itself. There were limits. Married women were excluded from watching the men's competitions at Olympia, with a later tradition speaking of the penalty as being thrown from Mount Typeum for those who violated the ban. The story of Kallipateira, a widow from Rhodes who disguised herself as a trainer to watch her son compete and was discovered when her clothes caught, belongs to a later era. The sanctuary spared her because her family had produced multiple victors, but then required all trainers to enter the stadium naked, like the athletes, to prevent such disguises. The rules around nudity also evolved. In the earliest centuries, athletes may have worn loincloths. A tradition attributes the first complete naked running to Orsippus of Megara in 720 BCE, who supposedly shed his perizoma during the race and claimed that nakedness improved performance, setting a new standard. None of this yet applied to 776 with certainty. The first games were a point of origin, not a completed system. Travel to Olympia from distant regions involved roads that were simple and rough, with river crossings and mountain passes. The sacred truce enabled movement, but the journey required provisions and planning. Athletes did not live in a vacuum. They came as members of delegations, with trainers, friends, and in some cases, city envoys carrying dedications. Early on, the infrastructure to house and feed large numbers of visitors was minimal. Elis itself lay to the north. Its officials oversaw much of the festival's logistics, just as they celebrated the victor's name when it belonged to one of their own. There is a temptation to imagine the first recorded festival as a crowd of thousands, but at the beginning, scale was likely modest. Participation grew with reputation. From this first event, though, some essential patterns were set. The crown would always be wild olive. The names of victors would be remembered and dated. The truce would be proclaimed. Men would stand before Zeus in a sublime ritual of running, a prayer enacted by the body. The year 776 BCE sits at the cusp of change in the Greek world. Colonization into the Western Mediterranean and the Black Sea would soon accelerate. Cities like Corinth would send out settlers. Ionian cities would look east toward Asia Minor. Artistic forms would shift from the abstracted to the more representational. The political experiments that matured into classical democracy and oligarchy lay ahead by centuries. Yet already, the idea that Greeks, who fought their neighbors as readily as they traded with them, could converge in peace to honor a god spoke to a logic that would bind them in later crises. When Persians came, the notion of pan-Hellenic cooperation found a rallying point in places like Olympia and Delphi. The Olympic festival from the beginning expressed a fierce local pride and a larger sense of belonging to a world of Hellenes. A first-time traveler approaching Olympia for that inaugural recorded festival would have come through country scented with olive and pine, hearing news from heralds who had traversed the Peloponnese and beyond. He would have known that the stadion race awaited, that men from other cities, perhaps better known for their ships or their poets, would be present to test themselves in a straightforward trial of speed. The runner's preparation would have been simple by later standards, governed by personal regimen and the advice of a trainer experienced in local contests. Diet and discipline were topics of interest long before formalized gymnasia. Greeks debated how best to build endurance and strength. But the customs that later attached to Olympic preparation, such as a mandatory month of training in Elis overseen by officials, are not securely attested for the very first games. What is certain is the core, a sprint over a measured earth, a judge to award a crown, and a crowd to remember the name. Memory, recorded and sung, transformed such a moment from a town's race into a continental institution. The recording of Koroibos's name did not happen by magic. Sanctuaries kept lists for religious and administrative reasons, inscribing names on tablets or maintaining oral registers that were later committed to writing. The practice created a backbone for chronology. Historians came to refer to events as occurring in the nth Olympiad, in the year of such and such stadion victor. It was a system that allowed them to anchor history across cities with different calendars and different local systems of reckoning. The fact that Koroibos was an Elean underscores another pattern. Custodianship conveyed distinction. The host often produced the first victor remembered. Religious purpose dominated the atmosphere of the festival, even as sport took center stage. Sacrifices to Zeus preceded the events. Athletes swore oaths at the altar. In later periods, they vowed they had trained properly and would obey the rules. The principle remained from the beginning. The contest honored the god, and the god's justice governed the fairness of the field. For the Greeks, piety was not a private sentiment, but a public act. In moving their bodies in accordance with rules before a watching god, athletes performed a kind of ritual excellence that bound human effort to divine witness. The sanctuary's setting amplified this sense. Mount Kronion loomed as a witness. The Alpheus flowed on, indifferent, yet ever-present. The grove offered shade, and the suggestion that the place itself was alive, that the plane trees and olives and wild flora were part of a more ancient worship than the newest rites. In time, dedications from great cities would crowd the Altes, treasuries would rise, and an enormous statue of Zeus would be enthroned. But at the first recorded festival, the world's finest statement about athletic honor needed only a cleared straight, a staff-bearing official, and a wreath cut from a tree whose roots drank the same water as the altar's ash. The single-day structure of the earliest festival yielded a rhythm unlike later times. People gathered, sacrifices were made, the stadium was run, the victor was crowned, and rejoicing followed. Such simplicity did not diminish the moment. If anything, it concentrated it. The significance hung on clarity. The fastest man in Greece, so they would say, had been revealed, and his name would stand as a date by which future events could be measured. The winner returned home, having become a measure of time himself. In this way, human speed became a tool for anchoring history. The practicalities of measurement were no small thing. The stadion length at Olympia set a standard that other sites sometimes followed and sometimes adapted. The Greek foot varied regionally, and so stadia differed, but the core idea, a fixed, repeatable distance that any citizen could understand, was elegant. The runner confronted a known line, a task that did not rely on judges' complex scores or subjective assessments. The contest's fairness lay in its simplicity, and that fairness allowed a city's pride to invest in the result without arguing the terms. The first Olympiad's aftermath within Elis would have included processions and local honors for Koroibos. There is a later report that he was a cook by trade, which, whether literally true or emblematic, fit a Greek habit of making excellence seem available to ordinary men. This early democratic spirit in athletics, open in theory to any free Greek male of good standing, differed from aristocratic exclusivity in other realms. Though wealth, leisure, and training influenced outcomes, the festival's ideals projected a vision where innate talent and discipline could win a crown before all Greece. It was a foundational myth in its own right, supported by a ritual practice repeated every 4 years. The first festival also encoded a message about rivalry and restraint. Greeks loved victory and did not hide it. Cities competed for prestige, athletes competed for fame, yet all were subject to the rules of the sanctuary, violence of the wrong sort. Strike in anger, cheat, bribe, brought punishment. Later ages would cast the sin of cheating into bronze statues called zanes, erected from the fines of the guilty and set near the entrance as a warning. In 776, the principle was the same even if the statues did not yet exist. Zeus saw. The gods punished hubris. The crowd condemned unfairness. That moral arc gave the festival a dignity that transcended any one man's speed. In political terms, The first recorded festival took place under Elian oversight in a region where neighboring Pisa sometimes challenged control of the sanctuary. Rivalry over custodianship flared in later centuries, but the early narrative presented Alice as the lawful guardian. Casting Iphitos as restorer served that claim. The presence or absence of Spartan collaboration in the earliest period is debated, but that Sparta later prized Olympic victories is clear. The festival would draw champions from the Peloponnese, from central Greece, from Ionia, from the islands. It would become an arena where cities measured themselves, then returned home, bearing tales of their athletes' speed, their wrestlers' strength, their boxers' endurance. To locate the first recorded festival in 776 BCE is to accept the ancient Greek chronological consensus, compiled and refined over centuries by those who cared to fix dates for the purposes of history and memory. Archaeology confirms that Olympia was active in the 8th century, with dedications and the development of the sanctuary in this period. The dating apparatus that ties a specific year to Koroibos depends on later intellectual labor, but the tradition is internally coherent and in broad alignment with material evidence for the festival's development. The cultural truth does not rest upon an exact day so much as upon the coherence of the institution that grew from that day's sprint. Those who lived through that first recorded event would not have had the sense of founding an immortal institution. They would have known the gravity of sacrifice and the value of victory, but the rest, the 4-year rhythm that would run through Greek time, the way wars and treaties would be dated by Olympiads, the poems that would be composed for victors, centuries later, lay ahead, and yet the elements were present: a sacred place, a truce, a measured contest, a crown, a name. From such elements, the Greeks built a world in which friendly rivalry could stand within religion, civic identity could be balanced against common Hellenic belonging, and human excellence could be celebrated without the distortion of material reward. When later generations looked back, they remembered Koroibos as a point of light, the first name in a long chain of men who would define time. They imagined Heracles measuring the track, Pelops winning a chariot race against death, Iphitos consulting Apollo and proclaiming peace. They pointed to the altar of ash, to the grove's enduring trees, to the earth stained with sweat and oil. They told of a day when a man ran faster than all others who stood beside him, and by running, he joined himself to Zeus's honor and to the memory of all Greece. From there, the story moves forward. The widening program of events, the growing crowds, the laws that shaped fair competition, the emergence of celebrity and city prestige, the occasional scandal, and the many virtues the festival sought to cultivate. But all of that rests upon this beginning, in the grove between the rivers, under a summer sun, when a measured length of earth turned a sprint. Chapter 2. The People of Olympia. If the first recorded Olympic festival is remembered by a single name, Koroibos, its meaning rests on a multitude of lives and roles, each bound into the sacred order that gathered at Olympia. The festival's power lay in the way it drew people from across the Greek world, braided them into the ritual honoring of Zeus, and sent them back again with stories, alliances, and a sharpened sense of shared identity. To follow the people of Olympia is to understand how a one-day sprint in 776 BCE stood at the center of a social and religious choreography that gave the games durability. At the festival's heart were the Eleans, the people whose land cradled the Altis, and whose traditions claimed the right to administer the sanctuary. In Greek memory, their king Iphitos sought Apollo's guidance at Delphi amid plague and unrest, and received counsel, to revive the festival at Olympia and declare a truce. The Eleans adopted this charge as both piety and politics. They would be stewards of Zeus's honor and guarantors of the peace necessary for contests to unfold. The story of Ephitos lives as a foundational memory, not as archival decree, but as a public truth. Olympia existed as much because a community took responsibility for it as because a god accepted sacrifice there. From this claim flowed institutions. The Eleans chose judges, the Hellanodikai, whose authority would be one of the festival's pillars. In early centuries, their number and duties were modest. Later, their training and procedures became precise. Even at the beginning, the principle was clear. An impartial body from the host region would interpret the rules, admit competitors, conduct the events, and award the crown. They were visible markers of order, dressed plainly at first and later identifiable by distinctive attire. The trust they commanded mattered, because Greek competition, for all its celebration of excellence, was also a landscape of rivalry where cities and individuals pressed for advantage. The Hellanodikai stood as representatives of Zeus's justice on the field. To make the festival possible beyond Elis's borders, heralds were required, spondophoroi, libation bearers, who set out to proclaim the Ekacheria, the sacred truce. Their work began months before the festival, traveling roads and crossing seas to notify Polis that the time of Zeus's contest approached and that travelers to Olympia were to be left unharmed. This truce was no utopian end to conflict. The Greeks did not pretend that their agonistic world could be dissolved into perpetual peace, but it carved out a protected corridor in time and space. Armies could still maneuver elsewhere, but the path to Olympia became a kind of sacred artery. In later periods, the truce's duration was extended. At the outset, the essential meaning sufficed: make room for Zeus's festival. The herald's announcement did more than ensure safety. It structured the Greek calendar, binding far-flung communities into a cadence of return. 4 years would pass. Then again, men would gather in Elis's plain. One could plan training, dedications, and journeys around a rhythm that would persist through upheaval. Festivals embedded memory in repetition. As the years of Olympiads accumulated, the names of stadion victors became the spine of chronology. The figure of the herald thus belongs among the quiet architects of Greek time. Travelers who followed the herald's proclamation included an array of specialists whose presence reveals the festival's complexity. Trainers guided athletes' preparation. In early centuries, 2 terms emerged to mark their roles: Paidotribai, who taught the techniques of physical training, stances, grips, and the forms of discipline, and gymnastai, whose oversight could extend to overall regimen and supervision. The line between them was not fixed in the archaic period. Both reflect a culture where bodily excellence was learned, refined, and transmitted through instruction. Oilers, the aleptai, tended to athletes with the practical care of rubbing oil into skin before exercise and mixing dust after to improve grip, particularly in wrestling. Such practices were not mere sensualities. They were tools shaped by experience in making bodies perform. Each athlete in this early world carried the identity of a polis. The games were open to free males who were Greek by language and lineage, but winning under one city's name gave victories a civic weight. Cities might provide material support at home. At Olympia, the prize remained the olive crown. When a man stood at the starting line, he was both an individual and a portal for his city's pride. Later, tyrants and aristocrats would seek to bask in reflected glory. Poets would craft odes to fix names in the constellation of fame. From the beginning, The city shadow lay behind the athlete's shoulders, a source of expectation and celebration. The definition of Greekness itself, the Hellenic identity that set the boundaries of who could swear the oaths and step into the stadion, rested on language, customs, and the shared veneration of gods like Zeus and Hera. In an era when no unified state existed, sanctuaries were the gathering points that made Hellenic solidarity visible. Olympia served as one of those points. Men from Laconia, Messenia, Arcadia, Achaea, Boeotia, Attica, Ionia, and the islands converged in a precinct where dialects mixed and differences were held within a larger frame. The games enacted Pan-Hellenism without erasing local distinctiveness. Around the athletes, a web of craft and commerce unfolded. Metalworkers brought bronze tripods and figurines as offerings or wares. Woodworkers fashioned votive tables and small dedications. Farmers and herdsmen from Elis and neighboring regions led in cattle for sacrifice. The festival required food, drink, and shelter. In later centuries, buildings would rise to handle the influx of visitors. In the 8th and 7th centuries, accommodations were more improvised. Tents, open air, and temporary arrangements. Even then, the gathering fueled an economy, small by later standards, but real, where piety and necessity met. The officiants at the altar were essential in linking athletic effort to divine favor. Priests of Zeus presided over sacrifices, maintained the ash altar, and led the rites that framed the contests. The ash altar itself grew year by year as the burnt thighs of cattle dedicated to the god accumulated in layers, an archaeological palimpsest of devotion. The ritual act that Greeks called thysia, slaughter, burning the god's portion, and sharing the meat, made the festival a communion of sorts. The scent of roasting flesh, the smoke rising against the light, the sprinkling of barley meal, and the libation of wine composed a sensory theology. The athlete's oaths fit within this framework. Swearing to obey the rules and to honor Zeus by fair competition was a moral right as much as a procedural necessity. The stories Greeks told about who could watch and who could not illustrate the festival's shape. Married women were traditionally barred from viewing the men's competitions at Olympia. A single, notable exception appears in the figure of the priestess of Demeter Chamine, whose seat in the stadium looked onto the track. Her presence marked the way Greek religion often worked. Prohibitions were real, but not absolute. Exceptions were woven into ritual order. The wider world of women at Olympia included the Heraia, a separate festival at the sanctuary in honor of Hera, where girls and young women ran foot races in tunics cut above the knee, with the right shoulder bare, hair loose, and winners took crowns of olive. The Heraia belonged to a different calendar and administration, yet its existence at the same sanctuary points to an underlying fact. Olympia's sacred ground was not a purely male realm, but a complex religious terrain in which different rites interlaced. If the crowd could not include certain people, it did include a range of Greek society beyond athletes and priests. City envoys arrived bearing dedications or messages, using the gathering as an opportunity to be seen and to speak. Diplomacy happened in the shade of the Altis as surely as it did in city halls. Treaties were announced, alliances were signaled by gifts and public pronouncements. In a world where travel was costly and slow, festivals became political theaters, and Olympia, because of its prestige, was among the most important stages. The storytellers of Olympia's early history included those who wrote nothing down and those who eventually did. The first were the keepers of sanctuary memory, officials who maintained lists, priests who remembered names, and an environment that valued recounting the past accurately. In the 5th century BCE, Hippias of Elis compiled a list of Olympic victors. His local vantage point and antiquarian zeal created a backbone for later chronographers. Timaeus of Tauromenium, working in the Hellenistic period, refined the chronological scheme that anchored Greek history to the Olympiad system. Eusebius, writing centuries later, preserved these lists in new contexts. Without such scholars, Coroebos's name might have faded into the dust. Their work belongs among the indispensable labors that transformed a festival into a timeline. At the level of personal lives, Olympia's early victors embodied the game's ideal of accessible excellence. The tradition that Coroebos was a cook or baker, whether literal or symbolic, expressed a public imagination where a man of ordinary profession could claim extraordinary fame in a ritual setting. Later champions, wrestlers from the West like the men of Croton, or sprinters from the Peloponnese, would become near mythic in renown. But the message traced to the beginning. The altar and the track were not the reserve of hereditary nobles. They were places where training, courage, and timing mattered. The structure of training in the 8th century was still fluid. Gymnasia, in the monumental sense, belonged to later development within cities. In early centuries, exercise grounds were simple, and training was a matter of personal discipline and community knowledge. Diets were debated. Some advocated a regimen heavy in barley cakes, cheese, figs, and meat in measured portions. Others resisted overly specialized diets, seeking balance. The Greeks were observers of what worked, sharing methods among themselves. When later writers credited changes in diet or technique with improved performance, they were recognizing a process that had been underway since the earliest competitions. Tradition and experimentation interacting in the service of victory. Ritual shaped this preparation as well. Before competing, athletes and their trainers offered sacrifices and swore oaths. In later centuries, they did so before Zeus Horkios, Zeus of Oaths, whose statue stood in the Bouleuterion at Olympia. The principle, however, was continuous: to call the god as witness to the integrity of the contest. Oath-breaking was both impiety and a practical threat to the festival's legitimacy. The community enforced this norm. Fines and public shame awaited those who cheated. Later, fines funded bronze statues of Zeus, the Zanes, erected as warnings near the entrance to the stadium. This moral economy, visible in metal and story, rested on the shared understanding that the games, being sacred, were at stake when individuals yielded to bribery or rage. The starting line of the stadion in those early centuries lacked the stone blocks with grooved footholds that would become common in later tracks. Runners stood on packed earth, often marked by a simple line. The fairness of the start depended on the Hellanodikai's commands and the crowd's watchfulness. False starts could prompt reprisal. The finish line was equally simple. The judge's eye and judgment mattered. This minimalism heightened the value of honorable administration. Without technology to arbitrate, authority had to be trusted, and the community had to accept outcomes as legitimate. Olympia's success in commanding that trust is a testament to Elean custodianship and to Greek piety. One might imagine the first recorded group of athletes in 776 gathering on the edge of the track, having oiled their bodies, dusted for grip if they were to wrestle, though no wrestling was yet on the program that year, and shaking out limbs before the sprint. The crowd would include locals who knew the grove intimately, men from neighboring regions for whom Elis was familiar terrain, and some from farther afield, drawn by the herald's proclamation and by the promise of Kleos. Conversations would range from local news, harvests, marriages, the health of elders, to speculation about who would win. The mood held a mix of piety and excitement. Contests honored Zeus, but they also gratified the communal love of competition. The Eleans' neighboring communities, especially the people of Pisa, sometimes asserted claims over the sanctuary. This rivalry, latent in early years and explosive in some later episodes, framed the politics of custodianship. For practical purposes, in 776, the Eleans presided. Their assertion of control included defining sanctuary boundaries, policing behavior within the Altes, and setting the sequence of rites and contests. In a world where sacred and civic authority overlapped, the administration of a sanctuary gave a city prestige and leverage. That the Eleans connected their claim to Delphic sanction via the Aphytos story gave it religious weight, the kind that counted among Greeks. Among the festival's silent actors were the animals led to sacrifice. Hecatombs, the sacrifice of 100 cattle, are part of later magnificence. In early festivals, the number was more modest, yet the act was the same. A bull lowed, a knife flashed, a priest prayed. The thigh bones, wrapped in fat, were set on the altar for Zeus, as Homeric custom prescribed. The distribution of meat then sustained the gathered. This economy of offering and sharing made tangible the relationship between human and divine. Men ate together under the gaze of Zeus and in the immediate aftermath of commitments to fairness. The unity of piety and contest was not theoretical. It was as real as cooking smoke and warm bread. Spectators experienced the emergence of heroes. A man who won the stadion in front of all Greece acquired an aura that followed him home. Cities celebrated their victors with front-row seats at festivals, free meals for life, the Prytanean privilege, and statues or inscriptions in public places. Families spoke their names often, arranging marriages that enhanced status. These rewards, being civic rather than material prizes from Olympia itself, preserved the festival's core value. The olive crown was unbought, the honor pure. When later poets like Pindar praised victors, they did so by weaving their personal glories into the fabric of civic and divine narratives. That practice rested on early expectations that victory should be celebrated not only as an individual feat, but as a moment of communal pride and divine favor. The character of early athletes can be traced in how Greeks framed the virtues of competition. Speed, strength, endurance, and technique were the visible qualities. Less visible but equally prized were sophrosine, self-control, and dikaiosine, justice or fairness. The man who won by skill and restraint honored Zeus more than one who triumphed by fury or deception. Greeks did not turn contests into moral sermons, yet their language made room for the idea that the way one won mattered. Olympia's rules and punishments codified this sentiment. If Olympia was a mirror, it reflected Greek diversity. Dialects were audible markers of origin, the laconic brevity of Spartans, the smooth Attic speech of Athenians, the rounded vowels of Ionians. Clothing marked regional styles before athletes stripped to compete. Offerings bore the names of cities from far coasts. In this multiplicity, one hears the quiet work of sanctuaries as educators. Men learned to see themselves as Hellenes by standing beside others and recognizing a shared framework of gods and customs. The term Pan-Hellenic, of all Greeks, gained practical meaning where sacrifices burned and victories were crowned. The sacred olive tree at Olympia, from which the crowns were cut, symbolized the union of nature and ritual. Later tradition speaks of a boy with both parents living, a pies amphitheals, cutting branches with a golden sickle, a detail that belongs to later ceremonial elaboration, but that captures the idea. Purity and continuity framed the prize. The olive was wild, oleaster, not cultivated. Its untamed nature resonated with the ideal that excellence was a force drawn from a deep well, trained but not tamed into triviality. When the Hellenodikai placed the crown on a victor's head, they conferred not so much a thing as a meaning. You have honored Zeus by doing what humans do best when they strive fairly. At the edge of the grove, dedications grew in number. Small bronze figurines of men and animals appeared first. Horses, bulls, and human figures rendered in the geometric style, all sharp angles and abstracted forms. These were not decorations, but communications. A man gave a small bronze horse to ask for victory in a future chariot race. Another gave a figurine in thanks for a healing or a safe journey. The sanctuary accumulated these voices in metal, each piece a frozen petition or gratitude. Archaeology finds them in layers that correspond to the 8th and 7th centuries, confirming that long before stone temples towered, the grove thrummed with the traffic of votive exchange. The coming additions to the Olympic program, diaulos, dolichos, wrestling, pentathlon, boxing, chariot racing, and more, would draw new kinds of people into prominence. Trainers would specialize in different events. Cities would invest in horse breeding. Techniques would diversify. Yet even before those expansions, the human ecology of Olympia was fully formed in outline. A host people with sacred duties, judges committed to fairness, heralds carrying peace, athletes chasing a crown and a city's pride, priests tending altars, artisans supplying the needs of ritual and festival, envoys performing diplomacy, and a crowd who came for spectacle and left with stories woven into memory. Amid this multitude, the land itself remained a constant participant. The Alpheus River carried silt and story to the sea. The smaller Cladios traced a boundary at the sanctuary's western edge. Mount Kronion stood as a witness to the recurring human theater below. In the heat of summer, dust rose with each footfall, oiled skin shone, and shadows of trees provided respite. The festival was not only human ritual, but a seasonal inscription on a particular landscape. Greeks were keen to the power of place. They did not separate physics and spirit. Olympia's geography became part of the game's identity, as surely as the olive crown or the Hellenodikai's judgment. The stories of transgression that later ages repeated, disguised women entering the stands, bribes offered for victory, functioned as cautionary tales and as evidence that the community took its rules seriously. The legend of Calipatira of Rhodes, discovered when her clothing caught as she celebrated her son's success and spared punishment because her family had produced several victors, encapsulates the tension between prohibition and human desire that always haunts public spectacle. The subsequent requirement that trainers enter the stadium naked, like the athletes, is a reminder that rules adapt and that the games evolved not from an abstract constitution, but from the friction of actual lives lived under the gaze of gods and neighbors. These episodes belong to later centuries, yet the ethical impulse they reveal, guard the sanctity of the contest, animated the earliest games as well. From the perspective of a young athlete in the 8th century, the choice to travel to Olympia meant entering a larger world. He would meet men whose dialect he had only heard at markets, see offerings from cities he had never visited, and test himself under officials he did not know. This leap required confidence in shared norms and a willingness to put a city's reputation into foreign hands. The Eleans' success in making Olympia a trustworthy stage is one of the festival's understated achievements. It is visible in the steady enlargement of participation. As word of fair judgment and safe passage spread, More cities sent athletes, more families made the journey, and the festival's status intensified. For those who did not run, wrestle, or judge, the games were still a school. Boys saw men crowned and learned what Hellenes valued. Older men recalled previous festivals and corrected the young on details. Stories of Pelops, Hippodamia, and Oenomaus were told anew near the Pelopion, the hero's tumulus where sacrifices were made. Myth established a pattern, not as entertainment only, but as a conveyor of meaning. Contests belonged to the sanctuary's deepest memory. To tell of Pelops's chariot race near the Alpheos was to explain why the ground where one stood had always been charged with the energy of competitive honor. Within this human tapestry, the first recorded victor's name functioned as a keystone. Koroibos of Elis stood as both local sun and pan-Hellenic measure. His victory in the stadion created a date. In Greek reckoning, events could be located by Olympiad and by the name of the stadion victor in that Olympiad's first year. To say, in the Olympiad of Koroibos, was to anchor memory to a specific human achievement. The decision to mark time this way was both practical and poetic. It acknowledged that the festival's periodicity offered a stable framework and that human excellence, recognized publicly, could serve as a temporal landmark. The people who maintained this system, list keepers, scholars, and later compilers, performed a civic religious service of rare durability. The moral and emotional stakes of competition at Olympia were heightened by the knowledge that Zeus watched. Greek gods were not distant abstractions. They were present in the ordinary and the ritual. At Olympia, Zeus's presence took the form of altar, oath, and the shared conviction that sacred space demanded better behavior. When a runner stepped to the line, he did so not before a faceless crowd, but under a gaze that fused divine witness and human expectation. This cosmology supported the game's stability. A cheetah risked more than human disapproval. He risked offending the king of the gods in his own precinct. If one traces the line of the people of Olympia forward from 776, the cast expands without altering the essential roles. As new events joined the program, dated in Greek tradition to specific Olympiads, new specialists emerged. Wrestlers developed techniques to counter particular grips. Pentathletes trained in the interplay of 5 disciplines. Boxers hardened themselves to endurance. Charioteers and owners entered a world where victory belonged to the owner's name, rather than the driver's. The community absorbed these changes by elaborating rules and formalizing procedures. The Hellenodikai gained training. The heralds followed set routes. The truce's duration was clarified, and the sanctuary accumulated buildings to house functions, treasuries, stowers, and council houses. Through it all, the human pattern remained legible. Athletes, officials, priests, artisans, envoys, and spectators converged to enact a sacred rivalry under Zeus. The legacy of these people is visible in the way their festival became a central metaphor for Greek life. Philosophers used athletic images to speak about virtue. Statesmen cultivated an Olympic poise in public speech. Laws sometimes referenced Olympiads to date events. This cultural saturation would not have been possible if the people on the ground had not performed their roles with consistency. The Alliance heralds had to travel. The Hellenodikai had to judge fairly. The priests had to tend the altar. The trainers had to prepare athletes without collapsing into fraud, and the crowd had to hold all to account. In this sense, the first Olympiad's human order is not only a subject of antiquarian curiosity, but a model for how institutions achieve long life, by embedding ideals in roles and practices that ordinary people can perform. To return to 776 once more is to see a small assembly whose outlines foreshadowed a civilization's rhythm. The heralds had proclaimed the truce, the Eleans had marked the boundaries of the sacred precinct, the altar had been fed, athletes had arrived, some nervous, some brimming with confidence, born of many local victories. Trainers had argued, advised, and applied oil. The crowd had taken up vantage points in the stadium's earthen banks. The Hellanodikai had readied the crown, and then, for a measured length between two markers on packed earth, men ran as fast as their bodies could carry them. The judges named Koroibos the winner. The crown of wild olive rested on his head. His city rejoiced first, then Greece learned his name. The people of Olympia had done their work. What they did not know, what no crowd ever knows at an event's beginning, was how completely future generations would inhabit their roles. They could not see the treasuries that would be built by distant cities, nor the stone temples that would rise, nor the statue of Zeus that would rank among the wonders of the world, nor the long chain of victors' names sheltered in lists and song. But the people of that first recorded Olympiad knew enough. They knew that peace had been proclaimed, that Zeus had been honored, that a contest had been decided fairly, and that a man had become a measure of time. They knew that they belonged to something larger than their village or city, and they knew that in 4 years they or their sons would stand again in the grove under Mount Kronion, listening for the herald's voice. The early festival's human geography, 11 roles if one were to count them: host, judge, herald, priest, athlete, trainer, oiler, craftsman, envoy, spectator, and narrator of memory, was more than a snapshot. It was a template. It carried the games from one Olympiad to the next, including quiet years in which war pressed near, and prosperous years in which dedications multiplied. It transmitted techniques, rules, and expectations. It allowed a man in far-off Ionia or Sicily to imagine Olympia even if he had never been, because the roles were transferable. They could be recited, told, and reenacted. In that transferability lay the festival's resilience. The first recorded Olympiad thus shines, not because it was large or elaborate, but because it contained all the essential people and purposes in concentrated form. It was an act of faith, faith that Greeks could suspend hostilities long enough to compete fairly, faith that a crown without gold or silver could confer unmatched honor, faith that gods received sacrifices and returned favor, and faith that memory could be made orderly by tying it to human excellence. That faith was lived by the people who ran, judged, sacrificed, proclaimed, crafted, and watched in the grove by the Alpheos. Chapter 3. The Making of the Games. To reach the starting line at Olympia in the 8th century BCE was to pass through a web of preparations that bound body, city, and cult into a single endeavor. The moment a herald proclaimed the sacred truce, the festival entered men's calendars, not as an abstraction, but as a date toward which lives turned. In that turning lay the quiet labor that made the games more than a sprint across Earth. The preparation took form in training grounds across the Greek world, in roads and ships that bore travelers toward Elis, in the rites that bound competitors to Zeus, and in the careful choreography by which a simple program would grow into a multi-day order of events. The making of the games was as much a discipline as the running itself. The announcement of the truce began with the spondophoroi, moving along known routes. As they entered a city, they carried not only the word of peace within which participants might travel, but also a summons that touched prestige. To ignore Olympia's call was to declare oneself outside a set of shared practices that most Greeks prized. The herald's arrival marked the shift from ordinary time to sacred time. From that point, men who had been training with an eye to local contests or personal excellence recalibrated their ambition. They would, if they could, be seen at Olympia. Training in the 8th and 7th centuries was grounded in the gymnic culture of the Greek polis long before gymnasia took on monumental form. Exercise grounds existed in cities and villages, flat pieces of earth, sometimes marked with a simple boundary, near water for washing and trees for shade. The Paedo tribes taught techniques where there were techniques to teach, stances for wrestling, the right pathways of the arm for discus and javelin once those events entered the program, the subtle calibration of breath and stride for running. The gymnasts oversaw regimen, balancing work and rest. Oil was central. Athletes rubbed themselves with olive oil before exercise, both to limber the skin and, in wrestling and pancration of later times, to make certain holds more difficult. Dust followed for grip. Afterward came scraping with the strigil, a curved tool that lifted oil, sweat, and dust from the skin. These practices, which later writers described with a mixture of admiration and criticism, existed already in the archaic ethos, shaped by trial and the imitation of successful men. Diet was a matter of observation and debate. Barley bread, cheese, figs, and meat in measured portions formed the staple of many athletes' regimens, though the systematic meat-heavy diets famous in later anecdotes likely belong to subsequent centuries. Water and wine, mixed in the customary ratio, provided hydration without indulgence. Moderation joined exertion as a principle. The Greeks understood early that training required sophrosyne, self-control. An athlete who wasted himself in festivals or neglected rest would be slower when it mattered. Older men advised the young. Stories about how a champion had eaten or slept became law at the trackside. This was a culture of transmitted practice more than of written manual. Success bred imitation. Eligibility was a question first of identity and then of integrity. Olympia was a pan-Hellenic festival. To step onto its track, a man had to be a Hellene by language and lineage. The nature of this requirement was cultural, not bureaucratic in a modern sense. Its enforcement rested on a shared understanding that this sanctuary gathered Greeks. Within that frame, status mattered. A freeborn male, of good repute, untainted by serious impiety or legal disqualification, could claim the right to compete. Women's participation in men's events was barred, and married women were excluded from the men's contests as spectators. Boys and young men would later have their own divisions in some events. In the earliest recorded festival, the program was too spare to require such distinctions. In all cases, the games reflected the values of the society that made them, open to Greek males whose lives in origin and conduct fit a standard of civic belonging. As the festival drew near, those who intended to compete made their way to Elis. In later centuries, athletes would swear before the god that they had trained for a prescribed period. Tradition fixed this at 10 months, and would spend an additional period, a month, under the Hellenodike's eye, training at Elis before the contests. In the first recorded Olympiad, the formalization of such requirements remains uncertain, yet the logic that later produced them already operated. Time spent in disciplined preparation, visible to officials and to competitors, reinforced fairness. Even without a formal month in Elis in 776, men arriving early would train in the open spaces near the Altes, testing themselves on similar soil and in similar heat to that which they would face on the day. The roads to Olympia were not easy. Rivers had to be crossed, and food and shelter along the way could not be assumed. The truce made the journey safer, but not effortless. Delegations traveled together, both for protection and fellowship. A runner from Achaia might find himself in company with a wrestler from Arcadia and a slender boy from Sicyon, who hoped, in a future Olympiad, to make a name. They would share bread, water, gossip, and the rhythm of the feet that carried them toward Zeus's grove. For some, the journey was pilgrimage as much as ambition. Even those who did not intend to compete came for the spectacle and the rite. As the sanctuary came into view, preparation took on a different character, one governed by the sense of sacred place. At the altar of Zeus, sacrifices punctuated the days. Smoke curled against the sky. The fat from thigh bones crackled and sent a sweet, heavy scent across the precinct. The ash altar, an ancient mound of accumulated offerings, was tended by priests in continuity with long practice. This was Olympia's heart, more ancient than any race. Athletes and trainers offered small sacrifices, dedicating their speed and strength to the god, asking for favor. The presence of the Pelopian, the mound associated with Pelops, grounded the sanctuary in mythic time. The Heraion, which would rise in the 7th century BCE as one of Greece's earliest stone temples, announced that Olympia's cultic life was solidifying into architectural statements, though at the first recorded festival, the emphasis remained on altar and grove. The Hellenodikai, officials of the Eleans, sat in quiet judgment over the preparatory period. They examined competitors, heard disputes, and clarified rules. Their authority derived from sacred mandate and civic trust. In later times, they were trained, their number fixed, their dress distinguished. In earlier times, their authority was no less real for being simpler. They embodied the game's promise of fairness. If disputes arose about a false start, an infringement, or a claim to eligibility, their voices resolved it. The rods they carried would, in time, be used to correct infractions during bouts, particularly in boxing and pancration. In a festival with only a foot race, the emphasis fell on starts and finishes, on whose foot crossed the line first, and whether any runner had jumped the signal. The stadion, being the sole event at the first recorded festival, concentrated all the preparation of runners into the simplest of lines. The course at Olympia measured roughly 600 feet, a length that would be standardized at about 192 meters at this sanctuary. The starting line was marked, the finish line was marked. In the earlier centuries, stone blocks with grooved footholds and sophisticated starting mechanisms were absent. Runners set themselves on earth, compacted by many feet, eyes forward, bodies leaning into potential. The fairness of the start depended on the Hellenodikai's command and the runner's discipline. A man who leapt early invited censure. A clean start was itself a kind of ritual purity. To understand how the program grew from that single race is to see how Greek festivals evolved by accretion, each edition justified by precedent elsewhere or by the desire to test a different dimension of arete, excellence. The Diaolos, a double stadion race, was added in 724 BCE. The Dolichos, a long-distance race whose length varied by site and period, entered in 720 BCE. At Olympia, sources suggest a long run that could cover a score or more of stadia, testing endurance rather than explosive speed. Wrestling and the pentathlon arrived in 708 BCE. The pentathlon combined 5 events: stadion, discus, javelin, long jump, and wrestling, an elegant medley meant to assess balanced excellence. Boxing, with leather thongs binding the hands, joined in 688 BCE. The 4-horse chariot race entered in 680 BCE, drawing equestrian elites into the field, where the owner's name, not the driver's, would be written into the record. The pancration, a blend of wrestling and striking with severe holds and limited prohibitions, biting and gouging were forbidden, appeared in 648 BCE. The race in armor, the hoplitodromos, would be added in 520 BCE, runners carrying shields and, in some periods, wearing helmets or greaves, in a martial echo of the foot race that opened the tradition. Each new event brought its own preparation. Wrestlers learned to use leverage and grip, aiming for 3 falls to a victory, seeking to throw an opponent onto his back or force surrender. They trained on packed earth, dusted for grip, bodies oiled beforehand to prevent tearing, then dusted again to balance slipperiness and hold. Boxers hardened their bodies, learned to keep their guard, and developed footwork to complement blows. The leather thongs, the himantes, supported wrists and added weight to strikes without the padding of later gloves. Pentathletes practiced the coordination of disciplines. An arcing discus throw from a slight stone platform, once such were built. A javelin cast aided by a leather strap. The ankyle to impart spin. A long jump performed with stone or lead halters in the hands, swinging forward to carry the body farther through the air, and then the close combat of wrestling to conclude. The chariot race moved preparation to stables and tracks, to the breeding of horses and the training of teams to run straight and fast, controlled under tension on a course whose turning posts, the nisi, demanded nerve and skill. The hoplitodromos trained bodies to bear weight at speed, a practical exercise in the civic life of Greek men who might be called to run under arms. The impulse toward nudity in competition, which would become a hallmark of Greek athletics, had a history of its own. In earlier competitions, loincloths were likely worn. Tradition named Orsippus of Megara as the first to run naked in the stadion in 720 BCE, either by accident when his perizoma fell or by deliberate choice, setting a new standard that spread. Regardless of the exact moment, by the time the program expanded, the nude male body in competition had become a norm, praised for its display of unadorned human form and the equality it suggested. Without armor, without rich garments, men met on a level field. This aesthetic and ethical point intertwined with training practices that valued the visibility of the body for correcting posture and technique. As events multiplied, the festival's structure expanded. In 776, a single day sufficed. By the classical period, the program unfolded over several days under a rhythm that placed oaths and registrations first, contests across the middle days, the great sacrifice to Zeus at the altar as a centerpiece, and the crowning of victors and communal feasting at the end. The precise ordering of events varied across time, and our sources do not fix every detail, but the general progression is clear. Formal initiation into sacred competition, performance, sacrifice, celebration. The sacrifice, often a hecatomb in later times, folded athletics back into cult. Everyone present ate from the god's feast. The olive crown, cut from a sacred wild tree, kept the prize immaterial at the sanctuary, even as cities at home granted material honors. Buildings arose to support this growing order. The Heraion in the 7th century BCE marked an early statement in stone. The Bouleuterion, the council house, would eventually set a place for oaths and the administration of the games. Treasuries built by cities along the Altis' edge in later centuries displayed votive wealth and boasted of civic generosity. Porches and stowers offered shade. These constructions belong mostly to the centuries after 776, but their germ lay in the needs first articulated by the festival's simplest form: shelter for officials, spaces for gathering, and structures that expressed piety in durable materials. The ash altar remained, older than stone, older than lists of victors, the mound at which fire linked generations. The rules that governed each contest refined over time, but their core purpose was constant: to render competition fair and intelligible. In wrestling, grasping genitals or biting was condemned. Victory came from falls or concession. In boxing, striking a downed opponent could be penalized. In later accounts, some boxers agreed to climax, a trading of blows to break stalemates, a measure of endurance and fortitude. In the pancration, where almost everything was permitted, the few prohibitions carried special weight. To bite or gouge drew swift rebuke. The judges enforced these norms with fines and the sting of rods. The community watched. Cheating was not merely a violation of a rule book, it was an affront to Zeus in his precinct. Later ages erected statues of Zeus, the Zanes, funded by fines from those who had taken bribes or otherwise violated the game's integrity, setting them near the stadium's entrance as mute admonitions. Even without bronze warnings in 776, the ethos was in place. Victory must be clean. The long jumps practice offers a window into Greek attitudes toward evidence and performance. Jumpers held halteres, swung them forward to gain momentum, and landed in sand or earth. The aulos, a double-reeded instrument, sometimes accompanied jumps in Greek athletic contexts, giving rhythm to movement. Whether this accompaniment was employed at Olympia in the earliest period is not securely attested. What stands is the broader point that the Greeks did not divide music and sport as strictly as moderns. Technique was art as much as it was physics. The pentathlon's mix of disciplines was itself a kind of pedagogy, teaching balance and adaptation. A man who excelled in the pentathlon embodied a Greek ideal of versatility without specialization's narrowness. As the equestrian events took hold, the games integrated an aristocratic register into what had been a more broadly accessible program. Owners entered teams at great expense. The driver's skill mattered, but victory belonged to the owner's name. The course's turns were dangerous. Chariots could crash, horses could go down in a tangle of harness and wheel. The crowd's gasp at a near miss, or its roar at a perfectly taken turn, infused the sanctuary with a particular thrill. Equestrian victories became opportunities for cities and wealthy families to mark their presence on the Pan-Hellenic stage. Yet even in this sphere, the olive crown remained the prize at Olympia. The sanctuary did not sell its honors. At home, victors might be showered with gifts and honors by grateful citizens, but in the Altes, symbols reigned. The hoplitodromos, introduced in 520 BCE, reflected the Greek city's martial realities. Runners carried shields, and in some periods wore helmets. Greaves, once part of a hoplite's panoply, fell out of race practice over time. The length was typically 2 stadia, a martial echo of the diaulos that stressed the connection between athletic training and civic defense. To run underweight at speed required a different rhythm, a different pride. Spectators watched with a recognition that this contest, more than most, spoke to shared safety. Travel, lodging, and provisioning evolved in parallel with the program. In the early centuries, crowds made do with temporary arrangements, camping, sleeping under trees, clustering in open spaces outside the Altes. Markets sprang up in makeshift form. Water came from the nearby rivers and springs. Food was purchased or shared. As fame grew, structures would rise to house officials and honored guests, but ordinary visitors continued to accept rough accommodations as part of the festival's character. This was no city of marble apartments, but a sacred grove, and its surroundings transformed, for days, into a temporary city bound by ritual and expectation. The making of the games included the making of memory. Lists of victors were compiled. The ritual of proclaiming a winner's name at the sanctuary connected to the broader practice of fixing names in written or oral registers. In later centuries, poets turned those names into song. Pindar, Bacchylides, crafting complex odes that linked individual feats to myths and to the gods' favor. Even earlier, before such poetry, in fixed form, local singers and city traditions would have taken up the stories. A boy would hear his father say, "Koroibos of Elis," with the same mixture of pride and reverence that attached to a hero of old. The training grounds in distant cities then echoed with such names, acting as magnets for the next generation's ambition. One cannot isolate preparation from worldview. At Olympia, competition was not war by other means. It was a ritualized contrast to war. The truce proclaimed it. The olive crown affirmed it. The emphasis on fair rules and on the god's witness enforced it. Yet the games were not naive about human aggression. Wrestling and boxing channeled it. Pancration acknowledged it. The race in armor trained it. The Greeks did not pretend to simple harmony. They built structures to hold their love of contest within bounds that honored the divine and preserved civic relationships. Preparation in that sense was ethical as much as physical. The sanctuary's art bore witness to this ethic as it matured. Small bronze figurines of athletes and animals, dedications in the geometric style, proliferated in 8th and 7th century layers. Their forms, triangles, circles, and patterned limbs expressed a visual language of order and proportion that would soften in later archaic and classical periods into more naturalistic representations. These objects were acts of preparation too, in the sense that they educated the eye. A boy who looked at a bronze horse in the Altes learned what others valued and how they gave thanks. A man who saw a small athlete lifting halteres imagined that movement in his own frame. The first recorded festival's simplicity concentrated the effect of these preparations. There was the oath, implicit in 776 and explicit in later practice, to obey the rules and honor Zeus. There was the course, measured and visible. There were the officials. There were the bodies honed by months of training in city dust and country light. And there was the crowd. Together, they formed a machine for manufacturing a particular kind of fame, one that drew its power not from gold, but from recognition. When a runner crossed first, the preparation ended and the enduring part began, the fixing of a name in the sanctuary's memory, and by that fixing, in the time reckoning of the Greeks, because every addition to the program anchored itself in a rationale. The festival's growth can be read as a philosophy in motion. If the stadion measured speed, the diaolos asked for sustained speed. If the dolichos measured endurance, the pentathlons sought balance. Wrestling tested control. Boxing tested resilience under strikes. Pancration tested courage under near-limitless pressure. The chariot race honored wealth's role in civic display, but insisted that the owner accept a humble crown. The hoplitodromos connected civic defense with public honor, dignifying preparation for war without making war the festival's center. Throughout, the olive crown and the presence of Zeus's altar kept the games from dissolving into mere spectacle. Preparation had a purpose: to create a fair field where excellence could be seen and honored under the god's eye. As the festival moved from one Olympiad to another, the customs that shaped preparation stabilized. The proclamation of the truce followed a pattern. The arrival of delegations found an annual rhythm. The Hellenodikai's procedures sharpened. The oaths at the council house, once there was a bouleuterion to house them, became a public ceremony. Boys grew into men inside a cycle that their fathers and grandfathers knew. In such cycles, tradition becomes a living thing. Each generation prepares not only for a race, but for a role in a rite that precedes them and will outlast them. The making of the games, in this sense, was a making of Greeks. When ancient commentators later enumerated the dates of editions, the Dialos in 724, the Dolichos in 720, wrestling and pentathlon in 708, boxing in 688, the four-horse chariot in 680, the Pancratian in 648, the Hoplitodromos in 520, they were not only providing a catalogue, they were telling a story about priorities: speed first, then extended speed, balance, skilled force, aristocratic display, dangerous courage, and civic readiness. It is a plausible moral order in sequence. It also reflects the way the festival's reputation and capacity grew, permitting safer administration of more complex contests. You cannot have a chariot race without a track defined and an authority that the wealthy will obey. You cannot have a dangerous combat without judges the crowd trusts to intervene. Preparation thus included institution building, the hidden scaffolding that made public events possible. Standing at the edge of the track in the year of Koroibos and then stepping decades forward in the mind, one could see how practice accumulated into program. The runner who trained on city earth would, in time, meet a wrestler whose craft had been refined by a coach who had seen dozens of matches. He would watch a charioteer take a turn at speed and marvel at risk and control. He would feel the crowd hold its breath as a boxer absorbed a blow and returned another. Preparation made the crowd intelligent as well. Spectators learned what to look for: the clean throw in wrestling, the economy of motion in the discus, the posture that signaled a boxer's readiness, the tight line of a chariot's wheel past the turning post. A literate audience of the body emerged, capable of judging excellence beyond parochial loyalty. That, too, was part of the game's formation, a preparation of the public for fair admiration. In a modest corner of the sanctuary, a young athlete might have set his strigil, his oil flask, and his halteres beside a small offering, perhaps a bronze figurine, perhaps just a wreath of myrtle laid at the base of a tree. Before taking a last run down an improvised straight, he would feel the ground, the slope, the give of the earth. He would practice starts, lowering his center of gravity, coiling potential into ankles and hips. He would listen to his breath. When he stopped, he would scrape down, oil again, and sit in the shade, watching others move through their own rituals. Preparation bred contemplation as much as motion. In that moment, he belonged to a chain the sanctuary was forging. Men disciplining themselves not only to win, but to be part of a spectacle that honored something beyond themselves. By the time the Hellanodikai led the procession to the stadion and the crowd settled along the earthen banks, preparation had done its work. What followed, the run, the shout, the crown, was brief. The transformation it catalyzed radiated outward in time. The victor's city would adjust its honors. Aspiring youth would adjust their plans. Trainers would refine methods based on what they had seen. Heralds, in 4 years, would leave again with a message that assumed willing audiences in many cities. The games became an engine of repetition with variation. Each cycle trained bodies and refined practices. Each cycle trained a civilization in the habit of gathering under a truce to test excellence. The making of the games thus rested on an interplay. Ritual framed the contests. Contests justified the ritual's repetition. The crowd's trust sustained the whole. The single stadion of 776 BCE set a pattern that bore the weight of additions. Preparation was the quiet art that made such weight bearable. It took the form of oil and dust, of breath counted against steps, of oaths spoken before an altar, of heralds' words sounding in city squares, of trainers' advice, of judges' even hands, and of a people accepting that time could be measured by a man's run, and that a crown cut from a wild tree could bind a world. Chapter 4. The First Games. The day of contest at Olympia began not with a shout at the starting line, but with an act at the altar. In the grove, the Greeks called the Altes, where the ash mound of Zeus rose from centuries of offerings, the festival's sacred core asserted itself. The earliest recorded Olympiad, in 776 BCE, remembered for a single event, the stadion sprint, was framed by sacrifice, oath, and order. Smoke rose through the trees, barley meal was scattered, wine was poured. The thigh bones of cattle, wrapped in fat, crackled on the ash. The air held the smell of burning and the murmuring of a crowd that had come to see men honor Zeus by running as fast as human bodies could carry them over earth. The oath that bound competitors to the god and to one another belongs to the festival's essence. In later centuries, athletes swore before Zeus Horkios in the council house at Olympia that they had trained and would obey the rules. The principle reaches back into the archaic festival's core. The word given under Zeus's gaze. The Hellenodikai, Elean judges, whose authority gave the games their legitimacy, received the athletes and oversaw the integrity of the field. Fairness was both piety and policy. To cheat was to offend the god in his own precinct, and to injure a civic trust that made the festival possible. The earliest games relied on this woven fabric of fear and reverence, on the community's willingness to accept a decision as final, because the judges stood under Zeus's justice. The stadion lay to the east of the Altes, cut into the landscape so the crowd could bank along its sides and watch a straight stretch of packed earth. At Olympia, the stadion length was approximately 600 feet, about 192 meters by archaeological measure, though the Greek foot varied regionally, and tradition credited the measure to Heracles' pacing. In the earliest period, the start and finish were simple marks on the ground. Stone starting blocks with grooved footholds and sophisticated starting mechanisms would come later. In 776, men would have placed their feet on earth, compacted by many footfalls, lowering their bodies to coil potential in legs and hips, ready to launch forward at the judge's signal. The finish was equally simple: a line to be crossed, a decision rendered by human eyes trained to see a chest or foot edge ahead. Before the run, the festival's human order moved in procession. Priests led, the Hellenodikai followed, athletes and trainers formed behind. The crowd found its places. The priestess of Demeter Hermine, a notable exception to the rule that barred married women from the men's contests, occupied her traditional seat in the stadium, a reminder that Greek prohibitions existed within a ritual logic that made room for certain sacred roles. Men from many polis, speakers of different dialects, bearers of different civic identities, stood together in a pan-Hellenic moment structured by a shared religion. Heralds, the spondophoroi, had weeks earlier proclaimed the Ikacheria, the sacred truce ensuring safe travel to this place. The presence of men from far coasts testified that the truce was believed and the sanctuary trusted. The runners had trained in the months before on city earth and country squares, following regimens of exercise, rest and moderate diet adapted to their bodies and their traditions. Oil had been a constant companion, rubbed into skin before exercise, scraped away afterward with a strigil in a ritual of care that was practical and symbolic. In the earliest games, athletes may have worn loincloths during competition. The Greek tradition credits the full adoption of nudity in running to the early 7th century, a sign that the festival's visible practices evolved. In 776, what mattered was readiness, breath measured, limbs loose, mind steady, and a willingness to commit one's whole strength to a straight run that would be decided in moments. The crowd's intelligence was part of the moment's power. Even in a festival's first recorded form, spectators knew what they were watching. The stadion's virtue lay in its clarity. There was no jury to weigh degrees of difficulty, no subjectivity to cloud the outcome. The fastest man on a measured length of ground would be known to all. The Hellanodikai's command set the runners off. The runners' bodies enacted the prayer. The crowd watched the standard of excellence reveal itself. When the finish line was crossed, there was no ambiguity in the collective intake of breath that accompanies a clear victory. The judges named the winner. Koroibius of Elis was recorded as the first stadion victor whose name anchored an Olympiad in Greek memory. The act of recording mattered. Sanctuaries kept lists of victors, and antiquarians later formalized them. Hippias of Elis compiled a register in the 5th century BCE. Hellenistic chronographers refined the Olympiad system. Eusebius transmitted versions of the list in late antiquity. By their effort, the year we call 776 BCE was fixed in Greek chronology as the first Olympiad whose stadion victor was remembered. Koroibos. To say that an event happened in the Olympiad of Koroibos was to accept a system in which human achievement before a god provided the spine for historical time. The festival thus shaped memory as much as it honored speed. After the victor was named, the ritual of crowning bound the moment to the sanctuary's identity. The prize at Olympia was a crown of wild olive, the kotinos, cut from a tree, that tradition linked to Heracles and to the grove's sacred life. Later ceremonial elaborations spoke of a pais amphithales, a boy with both parents alive, cutting the branches with a golden sickle. The enduring truth is that the prize was symbolic, not monetary, chosen to reflect a value system in which the honor conferred by Zeus's precinct outranked gold. When the Hellanodikai set the crown upon the victor's head, the crowd saw not a transfer of wealth, but an enactment of meaning. Excellence recognized, kleos conferred, and the city behind the man lifted by association. The victor's name was proclaimed. It would be inscribed at the sanctuary or preserved in official memory, and it would travel with witnesses back to their cities, where public honors might be bestowed. At Olympia, the festival's ethos kept the prize simple. At home, a city might grant a victor free meals at the Prytanion, front row seats at public events, or civic privileges. Poets would, in later centuries, craft odes to marry a man's feet, to his city's story, and to the god's favor. Even at the outset, this pattern of sanctuary modesty and civic generosity was in place in principle. Olympia's role was to confer a crown. The Greek world's role was to remember and to celebrate in the manner proper to each community. The rest of the day matched sacrificial gravity with human joy. Meat from offerings fed participants. Bread and wine were shared in the shade of trees and makeshift shelters. Stories were exchanged about training and travel, about other festivals and local contests. Men who had not run felt pride in having watched and in having stood under Zeus's eye as witnesses to fair play. Boys absorbed the spectacle as a template for aspiration. Trainers took mental notes for the next cycle. The Hellanodikai, having discharged their duty, became part of the crowd again, their authority resting until the next festival. The order of the day dissolved into ordinary human fellowship, anchored in a sacred place. The The sanctuary's objects turned the day into an offering. Dedications multiplied as men and cities marked their gratitude. In the 8th and 7th centuries, small bronze figurines, horses, bulls, men, were common gifts shaped in the geometric style of the age. A runner or his family might dedicate a figurine to Zeus, with a simple inscription naming the giver and the god. A city might place a tripod in the grove. Over time, treasuries from different polis would rise along the Altis' edge to house such gifts, creating a sculpted geography of Greek rivalry and respect. At the first recorded festival, the accumulation had begun, but not yet flowered into stone architecture's full articulation. The ash altar remained central, layered by time and faith. Across the grove, the Pelopion, the mound identified with the hero Pelops, received sacrifices that linked myth to event. Greeks told the story of Pelops' chariot race against Oenomaus near the Alpheos as a foundational myth of contest in this place. To offer at his tomb was to place the day's sprint within a continuum of competitive honor stretching back into the mythic past. The presence of this hero cult within the sanctuary circuit grounded the festival in a narrative older than any list, older than any calendar. The belief that struggle and victory under divine eyes belonged to this ground. The simplicity of the first recorded program concentrated Olympia's identity. Later centuries would add the diaulos, the dolichos, wrestling and the pentathlon, boxing, the four-horse chariot race, the pancration, and the hoplitodromos. They would require additional days and more elaborate administration, but in 776, the one-day cadence created a clarity that shaped memory. Assemble, sacrifice, swear, run, crown, feast, depart. To the extent that the festival would grow, it would grow by elaborating on this pattern, never abandoning the core that made the day intelligible. Even in later magnificence, the stadion kept its primacy in the sequence as the archaic heart. The exclusion of married women from the men's contests, a rule associated with Olympia in antiquity, framed the audience and set boundaries that the community enforced. The exception for the priestess of Demeter Shamain highlighted the sanctuary's integration of multiple cults and the way ritual roles could cut across general prohibitions. Women's athletic presence at Olympia took the form of the Heraia, a separate festival with foot races for girls and young women, celebrated in the same sanctuary but on a different date and under different administration. The coexistence of these rites demonstrated that Olympia's sacred ground was capacious, holding multiple expressions of devotion and excellence without confusion. The political dimension of the day was present in the background. Envoys from cities used the gathering to announce treaties, display dedications, and cultivate alliances. Even a day centered on a single sprint opened space for diplomacy. Sanctuaries were theaters, and Olympia was a stage upon which cities presented themselves to the Greek world. Elis, as custodian, strengthened its regional influence by hosting the festival. The claim that Ephitos had received Delphic sanction to renew the games under a truce, the tradition that lodged Elean authority in a religious decision, was itself a political asset, making administration an act of piety. The first recorded victor's reputation began to take on a civic and cultural life of its own as soon as his name was announced. Some traditions described Koroibos as a cook or baker, a tradesman who became a measure of time by virtue of speed. Whether this detail was literally true or emblematic, it suited Greek values, suggesting that excellence was not the preserve of hereditary aristocrats alone. The sanctuary's ideal, an olive crown rather than a purse, reinforced this message. A man of ordinary profession could, through training and courage, stand before Zeus and be recognized by all Greece. On the way home, travelers turned the day's events into stories and into calendars. A man from Boeotia would tell his neighbors about the grove by the rivers, about the ash altar and the straight run, about the Elean judges and the way the crowd accepted their decision. He would pronounce Koroibos' name and create by that speech a shared temporal point in the Olympiad of Koroibos. A city that had sent a runner and lost would return with resolve to train better. A city that had not sent anyone would feel the pull of joining a world that seemed larger than any town's boundaries. The herald's proclamation for the next Olympiad would find a ready audience because the day had marked lives and reputations. The justice of the festival, being visible, became a resource in future disputes. If a quarrel broke out during a future contest about a false start or a boundary, the crowd could remember how this was handled before and expect consistency. The Hellenodikai's even hand, in simple matters like a sprint, became a guarantee of their ability to handle more complex events as they were added. Institutional trust is built by repetitions of fairness. In this way, the first recorded day's smooth running was itself a preparation for growth. It showed that a Greek community, bound by oath and truce, could administer a contest without descending into factional brawling. The land's role, steady and unadorned, gave the day its sensory shape. Heat rose from packed earth. The Alpheus moved in the distance, indifferent and enduring. Mount Kronion cast its presence over the grove and the track. The wild olive tree, sacred by use and story, offered leaves whose sheen caught the light as if to certify the crown's worth. These physical facts, the slope of the field, the grain of the soil, the smell of smoke and oil, anchored an institution in a particular geography. When Greeks elsewhere spoke of Olympia, they did not imagine an abstract place. They pictured a grove between two rivers and a straight course cut into a bank. A detail like the starting command's form, the word the Hellenodikai used, the gesture of the hand, does not survive with certainty for the earliest year. An honest storytelling must leave it unspecified. What can be said with confidence is that the start's fairness mattered intensely. A runner who leapt early could be called back or punished. The community's eyes were many. The judge's authority was concentrated. In later eras, the high-splex starting mechanism, with taut cords dropping at a signal to prevent false starts, made technology an ally of fairness. In 776, trust in human procedure sufficed. The outcome's acceptance shows that the Eleans had crafted a process that the crowd believed in. If one were to seek the day's emblem, it would be the moment of crowning under Zeus's gaze. The wild olive's wreath, set on a sweating head, said that Greeks could honor a man without paying him, and that a god's sanctuary could create a kind of wealth measured in the mouths of others. Kleos, the fame sung and spoken, was the coin that the festival minted. It circulated in stories, in inscriptions, and later in songs composed for victors. Its value increased as it passed from ear to ear, binding the victor to his city to the Greek world, and the Greek world to the sanctuary that granted the crown. The first recorded festival's modest scale is part of its significance. Later grandeur can obscure beginnings, but the beginning reveals the design. A sacred place, a truce, a simple contest administered fairly, a symbolic prize, and a record. Everything that followed, additional events, buildings, crowds, poems, relied on this design's strength. The day in 776 showed that a body in motion before a god, watched by a crowd under a truce, could carry the weight of a people's calendar and pride. It proved that a place like Olympia could be the staging ground for a pan-Hellenic identity that would matter in crises to come. At sundown, shadows lengthened across the track and the grove. Fires burned low at the altar. The crowd thinned as men returned to camps or began their journeys home. The Eleans, custodians of the sanctuary, took stock and tended to what it meant to keep a place like this in order. The Hellanodikai carried with them the knowledge that their judgments had been accepted and that their authority would be required again. Somewhere in the city of Elis, Koroibos was celebrated first as a local son, and then as a man whose name would stand as a temporal marker for all Greece. The day had burned bright and brief. Its afterglow would be time itself. When the next Olympiad drew near, heralds would again proclaim peace. Athletes would again train their bodies under local skies, then gather in the grove. The stadium would again offer its clarity. The crown would again be cut. The list would gain another name. The first recorded day had not been an isolated flash. It had reactivated a tradition and fixed it to a dependable rhythm. Those who had been present became witnesses and apostles of a rite that could be trusted to repeat. Their memory, framed by altar, oath, sprint, and crown, became the festival's most enduring structure. The spirit of the first games thus lies in a sequence that Greeks came to know by heart. Prepare in peace, honor Zeus, run or contend within rules, accept a decision, crown excellence with a symbol of nature, and bind the result to a calendar shared among cities that seldom agreed on much else. It was a simple sequence, but it was engineered to carry a civilization's sense of itself. In 776 BCE, under a Peloponnesian sky, that engineering proved sound. The stadion delivered its victor, the sanctuary delivered its meaning, and Greece, by repeating both, began to count its years in crowns of wild olive. Chapter 5. Aftermath and Legacy. The morning after the first recorded Olympiad in 776 BCE, the grove at Olympia returned to its ordinary rhythms. Ash on the altar cooled, footprints softened under drifting dust. Men folded their traveling cloaks and took the first steps toward home. Yet in the minds of those who had stood beneath Mount Kronion, the festival's pattern had imprinted itself with a clarity that would endure. A name, Koroibos of Elis, now existed as more than a victor. It existed as a marker in time. In that shift from an event to an era lay the enduring legacy of the first Olympics, the transformation of a local rite into the scaffold of a pan-Hellenic memory. From the second Olympiad onward, the festival evolved by repetition and accretion. Greeks measured time in Olympiads, each a period of 4 years, punctuated by a festival in Elis. Lists of winners, the earliest of which local officials preserved, and the antiquarian hippias of Elis would later compile, anchored this cadence. Hellenistic chronographers, such as Timaeus, then refined the Olympiad system into a historical framework. By late antiquity, Eusebius would transmit a version of the victor lists that scholars still consult when speaking of the earliest games. The act of keeping those names was itself a legacy of the first festival. It took a sprint run on packed earth and turned it into a calendar that every Greek could, in principle, share. The festival's program grew in a rhythm that reflected the Greeks' curiosity about excellence. The stadion remained the emblem of speed. Then came the diaulos, the double-length race, recorded by tradition in 724 BCE. The dolichos, a long-distance test of endurance, followed in 720 BCE, while wrestling and the pentathlon appeared in 708, boxing in 688, the four-horse chariot race in 680, and the pankration, a test of courage and control in a form of total combat, in 648. The hoplitodromos, The armed race entered in 520, a reminder that Greek civic life rested on citizens' readiness to move quickly under weight. Each edition expressed a judgment about a rate: excellence, speed, sustained speed, balance, skilled force, daring, and martial preparedness. By multiplying the ways a man could be measured, the Olympics taught Greeks to recognize many virtues in one place. As the program broadened, the festival's architecture and ritual elaborated to match. The Heraion, erected during the 7th century BCE, stood as one of the earliest Doric temples in Greece and signaled the sanctuary's maturation from grove to monumental precinct. The Temple of Zeus, built in the early 5th century BCE by the Elean architect Libon, rose in massive Doric form. Within it, beginning around the mid-5th century, the sculptor Phidias crafted a chryselephantine-seated Zeus so imposing that ancient writers placed it among the wonders of the world. Pausanias, who visited in the 2nd century CE, described how the god's face seemed to hold benevolence and power at once, his scepter and Nike crowning a vision of divinity that concentrated Greek piety into a single gaze. Phidias's workshop, excavated millennia later and found to contain tools and a cup inscribed with his name, rooted legend in soil. The statue's eventual loss, perhaps destroyed by fire long after its relocation in late antiquity, became a symbol of what time takes and what memory insists on keeping. The stadium itself changed by degrees: stone starting blocks with grooved footholds, and eventually the Heisplex starting mechanism appeared to ensure fair starts, the cords dropping uniformly at a signal to prevent false leaps. The track's banks were reshaped to hold greater crowds. Near the stadium entrance stood a gauntlet of bronze statues in later periods, the Zanes, figures of Zeus cast from fines levied on athletes who had bribed or cheated. Pausanias names a case from 388 BCE in which Eupolos of Thessaly bribed 3 boxers, their exposure funding the first Zanes and thereby turning transgression into warning. The moral economy of the first festival, Zeus sees, rules matter, acquired a permanent bronze vocabulary. Around the Altes, treasuries rose along the northern edge as city-states displayed their piety and prestige by housing dedications in small temples bearing their names. The Altes became a map of Greece in miniature. Athenian offerings echoing an imperial confidence, Spartan gifts spare and charged with their laconic ethics, Western Greek cities like Syracuse and Croton inscribing their strength far from home. These buildings did not replace the ash altar's primacy. They framed it, announcing that the sacred center drew the whole Greek world into orbit. The truce, the Ekakyria, matured into a legally and morally recognized interval in which travel to Olympia was protected. Heralds, the Spondophoroi, carried news of its proclamation to cities near and far. Violations were punished severely because they threatened the very premise that allowed Greeks to meet in peace, while the rest of their world remained volatile. Thucydides, writing about the Peloponnesian War, records that in 420 BCE, the Eleans fined the Spartans for violating the truce in a conflict with Lepreum and barred them from competing. A Spartan named Lycas entered his chariot team under the name of the Boeotians, and when he stepped into the track to crown his driver in defiance, officials whipped him. The story survives because it captured something essential. The sanctuary's rules answered even the proudest city and enforced a different order in the shadow of Zeus. Olympia's prestige drew the best from across the Greek world. Across the 2 centuries after 776, names of victors multiplied into a pantheon that Pindar, composing in the early 5th century, would celebrate in Epinetian odes. He sang of Diagoras of Rhodes, the boxer crowned in 464 BCE, whose sons and grandsons would also be victors, prompting an old man to hail him at a festival with the words that a man who had sons like these was not to be envied further. Pindar's poetry did not invent excellence, it transmuted it into memory, lacing a man's field victory with myths and genealogies that made one athlete's moment emblematic of Greek virtues. Milo of Croton, the great wrestler of southern Italy, belonged to this lore. Ancient accounts credit him with a string of Olympic crowns, often said to be 6, including a boy's victory, alongside numerous Pythian, Isthmian, and Nemean titles, an almost mythic figure whom later writers surrounded with feats of strength and, in some retellings, hubris. Arachion of Phigaleia became a darker symbol when, in 564 BCE, he won the Pancration posthumously. His opponent, caught in a hold, signaled surrender at the very moment Arachion died from a choke or a snapped neck. The Hellanodikai awarded the olive crown to the dead, an episode that set courage and the cost of glory into a stark relief that Greeks never forgot. Excellence in speed carried into the Hellenistic centuries. Leonidas of Rhodes set a standard that seemed almost superhuman to later admirers when he won 12 olive crowns across 4 Olympiads, 164, 160, 156, and 152 BCE, taking the Stadion, the Diolos, and the Hoplitodromos each time. His long reign across a dozen years of peak speed became a metaphor for disciplined constancy in an age when Greek cities lived under larger imperial shadows. A different kind of first belonged to Cynisca, the Spartan princess who, in 396 and again in 392 BCE, entered chariots and won. Because equestrian victories were recorded in the owner's name, not the driver's, her triumph made her the first woman known to be an Olympic victor by name. Her achievement was possible, even amid strict prohibitions on married women watching the men's contests, and highlighted how the equestrian sphere, tethered to wealth and ownership, could bend rules of presence while maintaining rules of honor. Olympia was never untouched by politics. Treaties were announced on its grounds. The presence of a city's delegation could signal alignment or aspiration. When the 4 great Pan-Hellenic festivals cohered into a recognized circuit, the Periodos of Olympia, Delphi's Pythian Games, the Isthmian Games near Corinth, and the Nemean Games in the Argolid, victors who won at all 4 became Periodonaics, celebrated as Pan-Hellenic champions. The Crown Games model, in which prizes were symbolic wreaths, olive at Olympia, laurel at Delphi, pine at Isthmia, wild celery at Nemea, preserved the ideal that honor in sacred precincts should not be bought. Cities at home could reward their champions richly. Olympia itself would not. The festival's rituals absorbed refinements without losing their core. Oaths were sworn before Zeus Horkios in the Bouleuterion, the council house, and judges and athletes alike bound themselves to fairness and discipline. Sacrifices punctuated the days, culminating in a great offering at the altar of Zeus that sent smoke skyward and distributed meat across the crowd, a theoxenia of sorts in which men, filled with sacred food, felt their belonging to a common order. Trumpet and herald contests, introduced in the classical period, granted their victors the honor of announcing events and winners, turning voice into a recognized craft within Olympia's orchestra of roles. At every step, the sanctuary insisted that the games were not merely a series of contests, but a single rite threaded through days with an ethical spine. Men learned in Olympia's dust. Trainers observed how champions breathed and paced, how wrestlers used leverage rather than force, how boxers guarded and counterpunched, how pentathletes paced their exertions across disciplines. Philostratus, writing in the Roman imperial era about gymnastics, looked back on the teachers and methods that the Pan-Hellenic centers had fostered. The culture of the gymnasium, in which citizens exercised and learned together, took cues from the Olympic ethos: discipline, respect for rule, and the ideal that the well-trained body could model excellence in the city's life as surely as in the field of contest. Philosophers lifted metaphors from the games. Plato, Xenophon, Aristotle, and later Stoics and Cynics used athletic struggle to speak about virtue, self-command, and the perils of hubris. Olympia's legacy thus included a vocabulary for ethics that audiences across centuries could understand intuitively. War did not spare Olympia's centuries. The Peloponnesian War pressed close. Rival claimants to custodianship, like nearby Pisa, sometimes challenged Elean control. Yet the festival's heartbeat proved resilient. Even when fighting continued elsewhere, the truce carved its corridor, and even when politics intruded, the sanctuary's rules maintained a ritual order that Greeks believed in. This stability did not arise from naivety. It arose from practice, from a community that had learned across generations how to stage fair contests under Zeus's eye and to accept results, even unwelcome ones, as legitimate. If the classical centuries made Olympia a symbol of Greek self-understanding, the Hellenistic and Roman centuries broadened its audience and shifted some of its tone. After Alexander, Greek cities inhabited worlds overseen by larger empires, and their festivals became both expressions of local pride and demonstrations of continuity. Roman elites, attracted by Greek culture, visited Olympia. Some competed. The dictator Sulla famously transplanted an Olympic cycle to Rome in 80 BCE to fund his wars, an episode that showed both the festival's prestige and the pressures imperial power could exert upon it. Nero, the emperor who loved performances, came to Olympia in 67 CE with a 10-horse chariot and a willingness to bend rules. Ancient sources say he fell from his chariot and was nonetheless acclaimed victor, a scene that Greeks preserved in memory as an example of how power could deform a sacred order without truly possessing it. Olympia endured such episodes by counting them as anomalies rather than as precedents. In late antiquity, the world that had sustained Olympia shifted. Christianity's rise altered the religious landscape. Imperial edicts restricted and then sought to extinguish pagan rites. A law under Theodosius I at the end of the 4th century CE against pagan sacrifices, and a later tightening of prohibitions under Theodosius II framed the legal environment in which the Olympic festivals ceased. The exact year of the last ancient Olympics is debated, often placed around 393 or 394 CE. But the festival's silence emerged from a confluence of imperial policy and social transformation, rather than from a single decree. The Alpheus and Cladeos rivers, indifferent as ever to human orders, compounded the end. Floods laid silt over the site. Earthquakes in the 6th century broke stone. The hill that had watched men run watched a sanctuary disappear under earth. What persisted was memory, sealed in texts and in the soil. Pausanias' description in the 2nd century CE gave later readers a guided tour through buildings and statues that in his day still carried stories in bronze and marble. In the modern age, travelers and antiquarians sought the sanctuary. The French expedition of 1829, the German excavations begun in 1875 under Ernst Curtius, and later led by Wilhelm Dörpfeld, exposed foundations, altars, and the stadium. Phidias's workshop came to light with casting debris and instruments that gave his legendary hands material proof. The ash altar's layers bore witness to centuries of sacrifice. Bronzes and ceramics recovered from the Altes spoke in the geometric idiom of the 8th and 7th centuries and in the more fluid speech of later styles. Archaeology restored a sense of place to stories that had wandered through texts alone. The modern Olympic revival in the late 19th century, beginning with the 1896 Games in Athens and associated with Pierre de Coubertin's advocacy, did not resurrect ancient Olympia's cult. It did, however, borrow its language, its four-year rhythm, and its conviction that symbolic crowns can matter more than coins. The new Olympics' laurel crowns, torches, and hymns channeled the ancient impulse without reproducing its religious substrate. Where the old festival honored Zeus and bound Greek cities together, the modern movement addressed nations, secular civic ideals, and a global audience. Even so, when a sprinter steps to the line before a world that holds its breath, the line from a Peloponnesian grove to a modern stadium is visible. The timing technology, the tracks, and the media are new. The human meaning of fair speed before witnesses is not. Back in antiquity, the legacy also took subtler forms. Cities dated laws, treaties, and decrees by Olympiads, weaving the sanctuary's rhythm into civic record-keeping. Sculptors made statues of victors that stood in public places, their proportions and postures shaping Greek art's canons. Myron's Discobolus, though not specifically an Olympic statue, and Polykleitos's Doriphoros, offered visions of the athlete that sculptors and audiences used to measure bodies and virtues. The gymnasium, which by the classical period had become a formal institution in many cities, blended physical training with education in letters and music. It took the Olympic emphasis on disciplined excellence and made it a daily habit for citizens who would never run in Elis. Women's place in Olympia's story, while circumscribed by the rules of the men's festival, nonetheless left its mark. The Heraia at Olympia, the women's festival in honor of Hera, with its own foot races, offered a parallel channel for honor within the same precinct. The image of girls running with hair loose and tunics cut short at one shoulder is fixed by later sources into a kind of liturgy of youth and grace. Cynisca's chariot victory, recorded like any owners, pressed a question that Greek societies answered to varying degrees: how to recognize honor across gender within frameworks built for men. Olympia did not provide a comprehensive solution. It did preserve a memory that the sanctuary's rules could be bent without breaking the core, and that the olive crown's power could reach beyond the male body on the track. The legacy of rule-keeping and fairness, so central to the first recorded festival, proved to be the spine on which later ages hung their admiration. Stories of bribery and punishment remained vivid because they reaffirmed that a sacred contest policed itself under a god's gaze. The Zanes, glaring in bronze near the stadium entrance, carried inscriptions naming the offenders and their cities, a rare ancient moment in which public shame was preserved not to humiliate forever, but to instruct permanently. Boys who read those bases learned that a crown was glorious, but not worth a broken oath. In this pedagogical function, Olympia taught more than technique. It taught citizenship. If we turn the lens back to 776, the seed of all this is recognizable. There is a track measured in the steps of men, and in the story of Heracles' stride. There is an altar whose ash bears the memory of years. There are judges with the authority of a city and a god. There are athletes with oil on their skin and discipline in their bones. There is a crowd, already a chorus, ready to witness and to remember. The growth of the festival did not submerge these elements. It amplified them. The temple of Zeus and Phidias' statue did not replace the ash altar, they framed it. The chariot race did not diminish the stadion. it extended the spectrum of excellence. The Zanes did not abolish cheating. They made the love of fairness public and enduring. The truce did not invent peace. It carved space for peace to exist predictably in a violent world. Greek historians and compilers recognized that the Olympiad system, born of the first festival's record, offered a neutral grid across city calendars. Herodotus's stories sometimes touch on festivals to date his tales. Thucydides assumes readers will understand the game's season. Later, chronographers used Olympiads explicitly as anchors for everything from foundation myths to battles. To say, in the nth Olympiad, was to evoke not only a date, but a scene. The grove, the smoke, the shout at the finish line. Time in Greece became athletic, in metaphor and in method, counted not by reigns, but by runs. The precise fate of the Zeus statue, whether lost in Olympia or consumed by fire in Constantinople after a relocation, is debated in sources, but its spirit remains an index of what Olympia were and meant, a meeting point of craftsmanship, theology, and public awe. The sanctuary's stones tell a parallel story. In the 11th and 12th centuries, a Byzantine monastery grew atop part of the ancient grounds, its monks living among columns and carved blocks. Travelers' accounts from the early modern period mention the site in fragments. When 19th century excavations lifted silt from the stadium and exposed the racing course's outlines, modern eyes looked upon the very soil that had decided Koroibos's victory. The earth itself thus became a text in which legacy could be read without a scribe. The first Olympics' most enduring gift to later ages is a set of ideas bound tightly to practice. First, that a community can agree to suspend its hostility for a higher purpose, and that such agreements repeated become tradition and then expectation. Second, that symbolic prizes, olive, laurel, pine, or celery, can structure honor more powerfully than coin when institutions enforce fairness and when witnesses believe in the field. Third, that human bodies, trained and disciplined, can enact a civic and religious ideal under rules that celebrate constraint as much as power. Fourth, that memory, kept carefully in names and lists, can organize a civilization's time without the need for a single ruler's calendar. When modern crowds stand in a stadium waiting for sprinters to crouch and explode into motion, they rehearse a pattern Greeks learned under a Peloponnesian sun. The virtue of a clear test, the thrill of speed measured in heartbeats, the dignity of accepting a victor without complaint. When nations march in an opening ceremony, the gesture echoes a pan-Hellenic impulse. We are many, but here we agree to be one for a moment. When athletes train with meticulous attention to diet, sleep, and technique, they join a lineage that runs through the oil, dust, and strigil of archaic Greece. When a scandal of bribery or doping breaks and the world recoils, the reaction is ancient. It is the sting of a broken oath felt by all who love a fair contest. The first Olympic festival, remembered for a single sprint and a name, unlocked all of this. It provided a grammar for public honor and a calendar for collective memory. It gave Greek cities a place to see themselves as Greeks. It offered philosophers metaphors and sculptors subjects. It aided historians in binding a scattered world into a comprehensible time. It taught that a sacred place can govern human behavior by ritual rather than force, and by eventually yielding its ash and stone to water and earthquakes, it taught that even institutions with the strongest roots pass, leaving behind the stronger thing to which they pointed, a human love of excellence, witnessed by a community that promises, for a little while, to be at peace. In the end, to speak of the first Olympics is to speak of beginnings that never stopped beginning. Every 4 years, Greeks reenacted the promise first realized in 776 BCE to meet, to race fairly, to crown excellence, and to bind their lives to that rhythm. The longevity of the festival was not an accident. It was a chosen discipline. For 1,000 years, men ran toward a line that once crossed made them measures of time. The grove between the Alpheus and the Cladios rivers, once a cluster of trees and altars, became the axis around which a people turned until the world changed and the axis sank into earth. Yet the turn it taught still moves us. It is fitting, then, to let the last image belong to that first day's inheritance. A crown of wild olive lifted in a judge's hand, the murmur of a crowd falling to silence as the wreath is lowered onto a victor's hair, and a name, Koroibos, leaving a man's mouth and entering history's keeping. The first Olympics began as a sprint beside an ash altar and became a way for Greeks to count their years, tell their stories, shape their virtues, and remember themselves. Its legacy endures wherever a fair start, a clean finish, and a simple crown still carry the weight of honor.